Now that we've established sort of the both the limits and the power of rational choice models, remember, rational choice models are about process and not about outcomes. And nevertheless, outcomes are, or changes in outcomes are observable, and that gives us kind of a way to look for evidence for these rational choice models. But at the same time, when it comes to policy, we got to think about judgment, right? So let's develop a toy model, and of course, all models are toys. And by definition, it's a model, right? And it's kind of a way of getting to some of the essence of things without actually kind of dealing with the complexities. But nevertheless, the complexities do exist. So I want to want to be absolutely clear about that, right? So what's kind of the fundamental issue here? So let's think about a rational choice approach. So in this rational choice approach, there's a person who has to make a choice, right? So on the horizontal axis, we're going to measure the choice of being a terrorist, and that's the quantity of terrorists along the, so let's say Q terrorists, or let's call that QT. And on the vertical axis, that's kind of being a normal person, okay? Let's try to see if this works. So you have a normal person. These are people who want to buy TVs, go out to eat, stuff like that, right? So let's call that QN. Okay. So we're measuring this on the axis. And the fact of the matter is, there's a limited amount of resources that somebody can put into being a terrorist or a normal person. Okay? So the resources might be, let's put it this way, limited in allocating to being a terrorist or a normal person. And you can think about this being basically money. So you can either kind of spend money to become a terrorist, or you can spend money to become a normal person. So there is that kind of level there. But it also might be psychic resources, right? And so you have a limited amount of brain power. If you're thinking about kind of going out and drinking and having a good time, well, then your mind probably isn't kind of worried about whether you want to blow yourself up or not, right? So we're not making any judgment about the type of resources. And so we want to leave it open to basically the judgment of the individual who's kind of looking at some analysis like this. So again, from the analytical kind of approach, we're looking at a process, remember, and we want to let people who look at this develop the analytical judgment. So the process we want to leave as general as possible. So we are not postulating what these resources may be, right? Basically, all we're saying is that some kind of resources. It's up to you, the policymaker, to figure out what these resources are. And again, notice I'm looking at a process here. On the other hand, there are, preferences. Okay? Now, preferences can take many forms. We're going to assume, and by the way, we don't have to, and I'll give an example of that later on, that both terrorism and being a normal are just ordinary goods to this person. So think of this as somebody who kind of grew up in a banlieue in France. On one hand, they can go out and party. On the other hand, they can go join ISIS. And the fact is, people make these kind of choices all the time. So there is that. So what does this preference system look like? Well, let's kind of first draw a resource. Let's see if you can actually kind of do this. Ta-da! So that's the resource line. And I'm going to keep to the red here. So R represented by the budget constraint, okay, which is basically R equals the price of normal goods times the quantity of normal plus the price of terrorism times the quantity of terrorism, right? So this is your total expenditure. So R is the total expenditure on both goods. And basically, if you're on this line, then you've kind of maxed out all your resources. So maxing out all resources on the red line. Now, if you rewrite that, it turns out that the slope of this line is gonna be the price of minus price of t over price of n. Okay, you can kind of work that out on your own if you want to. That's just basically y equals mx plus b kind of a deal. But then what does the slope actually tell you? That's the rate at which the individual can substitute one resource for another. Okay? Basically, it's kind of an opportunity cost. Not kind of, it is an opportunity cost. Okay? On the other hand, we have preferences. And let's go all nuts and kind of go green. Remember, we assumed that both were goods. And so basically the point we're going to make is that as the individual has more of one good, the value of that good goes down while the value of the other less, the one that he has less of now, good goes up. What does that mean? In the context of the picture, it means that you have a set of preferences that look like that. Okay? And you've seen that as indifference curves. So let's call that I1. Let's call this I3. You know probably why. And then I4, obviously, you want to go on the highest possible indifference curve. By the way, if you want to go on the highest possible indifference curve, do you have to know consciously that you're trying to do that? No, you don't. It's just that your mind kind of automatically kind of takes you there, and but at the same time, if you look at what's happening along this indifference curve, as you have more and more of one good, the slope becomes flatter and flatter, and what that basically means is kind of the same point that we made is that as you have more and more of one good, a smaller amount of the other good is going to compensate you for a loss of. So, for example, if somebody has a lot of quote unquote terrorist goods, well, a small amount of normal goods are going to compensate them for the terrorist good. So, which means that terrorism has become less valuable as they have more of it. Now, this may not be a plausible assumption, but you got to start somewhere. And by the way, we'll look at a model where people just are kind of have a preference for terrorism. So we'll talk about that as well. So what happens now? Well, as you know from your intermediate micro, the highest possible indifference curve is gonna be somewhere over there. Let's call that I2. That's kind of where they're gonna be, and that's where the willingness to trade off one good matches up with the ability to trade off one good. So basically, the indifference curve kind of points out the slope of the indifference curve is the willingness to give up one good for another. Basically, notice if you have more of something, you're kind of more willing to give it up because it's less valuable, and that's how this particular sentence fits in with what we just said in the previous, that part of the green section. So when do you optimize? So optimize basically means when willingness to give up one good for another matches the opportunity cost, which you go back here, let's call that point A. Okay, so what does that mean? This means that the terrorist is going to choose QT one amount of terrorism and QN one amount of the normal good. So far, so good, right? Of course, we can't observe this, but remember what we said about what we can observe. We can observe changes in behavior, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, let's take a look. Let's say, for example, the price of terrorism has gone up. How might the price of terrorism go up? Well, the price of terrorism might go up if, for example, there's more policing, right? So it's more costly to be a terrorist because there's more police. Or maybe there is kind of a, let's see. There you go. Okay, that's the closest we're gonna get. And let's kind of go ahead and draw this. Yeah. And go ahead and put that back. And of course, you notice that because of policing, the quantity of terrorism has gone down. At the same time, it's more expensive to have police and things like that, which means people's normal behavior has gone down as well. You can think of these as kind of normal behavior has gone down because of loss of civil liberties or things like that, right? So basically, here's what we have done. If you raise the price of terrorism, you'll get less terrorism. In other words, terrorism is just like, any other good. And as a consequence, these we have a predictable hypothesis. So what's kind of the testable hypothesis here? Well, the testable hypothesis here is to say that as the price, so H1 would be as the price of terrorism goes up, the quantity of terrorism goes down. H2, based on this model, as the price of terrorism goes up, the quantity of normal goods goes down, of regular goods goes down as well. Now this result, the second one and the first one, depends on things like the income and substitution effects. I'm not going to go into that. I talk about that in a little bit more detail in my intermediate micro class, but you get the picture, right? But at the same time, all I'm saying is that, we got a bunch of hypotheses, right? So again, what is the purpose of the rational choice models? The purpose of rat choice, or any model really, is to generate, and this is the key thing, falsifiable hypotheses. The math itself is not the point. The point is that the math generates falsifiable hypotheses, okay? And now we've got one. And of course, I gave you a bunch of readings talking about, what we know and what we don't know about terrorism. I'll give you some more, but you get the picture.